My name is Gerry Low Sabado, and I am a fifth-generation descendant of the Chinese villages in Point Lobos, Pebble Beach, Pacific Grove, Monterey. I was born and raised in Monterey. I grew up not knowing anything about Chinese history. My own history here reaches far back. My ancestors came to the Monterey Peninsula in 1851. They came from China in a Chinese junk or a Chinese ship with no engine. Can you imagine that? They landed in the area near Point Lobos and eventually settled in Whalers Cove. There is a whaler's cabin there right now that has a picture of my great-grandmother hanging in the back of the cabin. The first time I saw that picture, I didn't even know that this lady was my great-grandmother or that I was related to her at all. I saw that she was standing in front of a house, and I said to my sister, that looks like Grandma's house. But we just thought that all the houses were built the same, and I didn't think anything of it. I didn't even take a picture of the picture. And when we came home, my mother, who was ill at that time, told us that when we told her that we saw a picture of a Chinese lady in front of a house that looked like Grandma's house, my mother said that that was her grandmother. And her name was Kwok Moi. Also, she was known as Spanish Mary. Eventually, as she was growing up in Point Lobos, she was raised with the Native American Indians. She learned to speak 5 languages. She learned to speak Chinese, English, Rumsey and Indian because she was raised with the Native American Indians there. She spoke some Portuguese and she spoke Spanish. Later on, I think when she was more in the Monterey area, Spanish-speaking people would ask her to translate for her. And I believe that, while I didn't know growing up about her history, I've had to make some deductions or some assumptions that because she spoke 5 languages, I believe that she was a very smart woman. I think she was a very strong woman. I also feel that for her to have been able to learn those languages, she must have interacted with those different ethnic communities. And I believe that she became trusted, and because of that, people felt comfortable asking her to translate for them. I don't think that would happen if she wasn't a trusted female in the community. The Chinese fishermen drifted into the Point Lobos area. They settled there and continued to be fishermen. I believe they came in search of gold, but instead ended up here on the Monterey Peninsula where the Bay area is similar to the area in China where they were from, and they remained fishermen. And my family remained in the fishing business until 1973. Eventually, my ancestors moved from Point Lobos to Pescadero Point. They eventually then moved on to what was known as the Point Almayas or Point Alones Chinese village in Pacific Grove. That is where the present-day site of Hopkins Marine Station is, and swings around to where the aquarium is. And that's where my grandfather was born in 1881. The Chinese fished for squid. They dried squid there, and the smell of that drying fish was offensive to the townspeople, and there was a push to move them away from that area. During that time also, in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act went into effect. There was a competition for the fishing grounds, and eventually laws were made that prevented the Chinese from fishing during the day, and so they fished at night. I've been told that my grandfather would wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and go out in the little fishing boat, go out into the ocean. Can you imagine how cold that must have been, how dark? I also was told he didn't swim. So how dangerous. that was. But they made a living. Ed Ricketts would come to my grandfather's house and ask him to catch eels for him. Any kind of sea life that was something different, they would bring to Ed Ricketts, and he would use at his Pacific Biological Lab. One of the things I think that's important to know, and it's just kind of coming out, is the relationship between Doc Ricketts and the Chinese fishermen, and eventually the work that the Chinese fishermen and the women performed in the canneries on Cannery Row. So my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, my aunties, my uncle all worked in the canneries on Cannery Row. My uncle was in charge of the label-making machine at the Monterey Canning Company. To become in charge of the label-making machine, again, was a position of trust. And I think that tells me something about of my family, that in a time when the Chinese Exclusion Act was in effect, when people didn't trust Chinese, it seems to me that on Cannery Row and in the Monterey area, I find that people of importance did trust my family. I'm very proud of that. If you look where the Monterey Canning Company is on Cannery Row, if you just go up like half a block and turn right onto the recreation path, you will see the Guacamole Tea Room and the Wave Street Studio, which is underneath where my grandparents' house was. So after the village burned down mysteriously in May 16, 1906, some of the Chinese whose homes did not burn down continued and tried to rebuild. Some of the work kept being pulled down. Eventually, in 1907, almost a year to the date of the fire, the last Chinese man left Point Almaeus village, and that man was Tuk Lee. He was my great-grandfather on my father's side. Most of the villagers, I would say, moved away. They moved to Salinas, Watsonville, Santa Cruz, San Francisco. A few families remained in Monterey, and my grandfather, my mother's father, is one of those who stayed. And so they lived in the Maccabee Beach. They stayed there till about 1920, then moved up to the house on Wave Street, 774 Wave Street. My family stayed in the fishing business until 1974. We had a fishing company on Wharf Number 2 from the 40s to 73. It was called Regal Seafood, and we had Italian fishermen fished for us. Our general manager was Japanese, Haru Asaki. We had Mexican workers. We had the Japanese ladies who worked with my mother, filleting the fish. And so during that time, it was a multicultural time. And it was a time that I remember where these members of the different cultures worked together and got along, and our company, Regal Seafood, was very successful. We were the West Coast buyers for Star-Kissed tuna. Eventually, in 73, we sold our business to one of the Italian fishermen, Joe Panizzi. Now it's called, the company is called Royal Seafood. Just this past Saturday, on May 14th, Mayor Carmelita Garcia and the Pacific Grove Heritage Society, the National Coalition Building Institute, and the ACLU and descendants of the village and friends got together at the Pacific Grove Museum of Natural History for the second annual Walk of Remembrance of Pacific Grove's Chinese fishing village. Now is a time when the communities are realizing that that Chinese story has been quiet for over 100 years. And now people are more willing to talk about it. The museum was packed. We had standing room only. Somebody emailed me and told me he couldn't even get into the building. And as we walked along, people joined us. People smiled. They saw the lions. I think they were very surprised to see the lion dancers leading the procession from the museum down to Lover's Point and along the recreation trail, which is laying on top of the railroad tracks that my great-grandfather helped to build coming into Pacific Grove. So everything about that walk, even just walking on that recreation path, is really meaningful and important to me and to the Chinese community.